Thank you, Mo, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please do carry on with your lunch while we commence this panel. My name is Ian Storey. I'm a senior fellow in the Regional Political and Strategic Studies program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And it's my great pleasure to moderate the third panel. Third? Yes, third panel of today entitled Managing Regional Flashpoints. So in this session, we'll be looking at some of the major potential, let's emphasize that word, potential flashpoints in the region, including the South China Sea dispute, the Taiwan Straits, and the Korean Peninsula. And we'll be asking the question, what role ASEAN can play in helping manage these security problems? Although two of these flashpoints are located in Northeast Asia, Taiwan Straits and the Korean Peninsula, armed conflict in either of these areas would, of course, have a devastating impact on the region, including massive supply chain disruptions and fractured relations among the major powers. In the case of the Taiwan Straits, actually in both cases, even before conflict broke out, repatriating hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians from these areas would present a major logistical nightmare for regional states. In the South China Sea, ASEAN plays a more direct role. For nearly a quarter of a century now, ASEAN and China have been discussing ways to manage tensions through a code of conduct, about which I'm sure Jay will be telling us more presently. So I'm joined this afternoon by three great speakers. They're also three of my friends. One is a very old friend, and I have two newer friends here who I got to know this year when I visited Taiwan in May. Our first speaker is Professor J. Batongbacal from the University of the Philippines College of Law. I'm sure you know Jay is one of the region's leading experts on maritime law and has written and presented extensively on the South China Sea dispute. Our second speaker is Professor Kristy Su. She's the director of the Taiwan ASEAN Studies Centre at the Chonghua Institute of Economic Research in Taipei, where her research focuses on trade and development issues. And our third speaker is Dr. Yongwook from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here in Singapore, where he specializes in international relations with a focus on Northeast Asia. So each presenter will speak for around 15 minutes, and that should give us about 45 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So without further ado, Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ian, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for inviting me to come to the ASEAN Roundtable. It's always a pleasure to be here. So the question posed to me was, is the code of conduct for the South China Sea viable? Okay, could we have the PowerPoint presentation on the screen for better illustration?
Can we have the PowerPoint up, please? Our tech people, our tech geniuses, please.
Oh, there.
Do your magic.
Okay,
thank you.
So now, first of all, the discussions about the code of conduct on the ASEAN scene has been there, as Ian mentioned, for more than 25 years. In fact, if you were to trace it to probably the genesis of the concept, it's 31 years. But what is a code of conduct? Right now, especially in recent months, there's always been a lot of attention paid by the press and by the public to the current status of these code of conduct negotiations, and yet very few people actually probably understand the long history of these negotiations. So the code of conduct is actually based on an idea that was put forth back in 1992, and you'll find the origins of it in ASEAN. It probably is one of the key contributions of ASEAN to the region in terms of efforts to try to manage the South China Sea disputes, which has been known as the mother of all disputes with its complicated mix of territorial and maritime disputes. Now, the underlying concept, when you think about it, really is that, number one, it's a normative effort. It's trying to establish rules beginning with a soft and binding agreement on rules of behavior between the disputing parties, and with an initial agreement on the soft and binding rules, soft non-binding rules, then that is supposed to create habits of cooperation and coexistence. Okay, and that is supposed to be the key now to the end point, which is the emergence of hard obligations and binding rules. Okay, and that is supposed to be the way to try to progressively resolve, no, differences over these claims. Now, the other thing about it is that it is by nature a transitory concept, meaning that it is established pending settlement because it is part of the dispute settlement process. And as such, it is intended to manage the disputes, no, before that settlement, meaning respond to incidents and crises, prevent escalation, and to create room for negotiation so that the parties again will not find these disputes going out of control and creating armed conflict. As a corollary to that, it is supposed to stabilize the status quo, no? Because any change in status quo would move the disputes either towards towards a resolution which may not be that which is expected or amicable or mutually acceptable to all the parties concerned. Okay, so if that's the idea of this whole code of conduct effort, no, it's like trying to engage in soft incremental agreements that eventually end up with a resolution. Um, if we then consider that there are certain criteria for that kind of concept to work. Okay. One, of course, is the stability of the status quo, meaning the situation between the parties at the time they engage in this effort must more or less remain the same. There must be no major changes in that situation, which would give the parties a sense that somebody is taking advantage of the other or gaining some undue leverage, no, an undue advantage due to the change in the situation. That also requires that all parties mutually engage in self-restraint, meaning they prevent themselves from taking unilateral actions, which would destabilize the status quo and change essentially the situation of the parties at the beginning of this process. This requires, in turn, a lot of good faith on the parties, the participants. And good faith here is evidenced by number one, trust and confidence with each other, that the other will act as expected, as agreed upon, and will not suddenly turn around, no, and break agreements or take advantage of the other's restraint. Second, non-prejudice, meaning any actions that they do take, no, that they do agreed upon, even if it might be controversial to some, they have an agreement that it is non-prejudicial, meaning it does not at all affect the situation of the parties, no, which contributes to the resolution of the dispute. So, like for example, you can take an action, but you will agree that it will not have any legal ramifications, and it will not affect the eventual settlement of the dispute. A third one is that there should be no unilateral and direct interference, and this is implied, meaning that you will not actively provoke the other side through direct unilateral activities, no, which are destabilizing, which could affect the status quo, or which are evidence of the lack of self-restraint. And lastly, respect, essentially, meaning that throughout this process, the parties are supposed to give each other their due respect, no, and not try to undermine the status of the other. Um, Equality is an essential characteristic here, meaning the parties must consider themselves as equal to one another. No, no one is entitled to more than the other, for example. And also mutuality, that you're all in this together, that the agreement, no, binds everyone or none at all. Okay. So when you think of these criteria, you can then look at the history of the South China Sea disputes, particularly the incidents that took place in there, in relation to this process. And I would start with, for example, the genesis of the disputes in 1956 and compare the events there, the incidents in the South China Sea, all the way up to 1992. During this time, there were no special rules of behavior between the parties, really. And the only international law, particularly the UN Charter, the non-use of force, that was the only thing. Those are the only principles, really, that were sort of restraining the parties from taking any more drastic actions. Interestingly, during this time, this was the early stages of the parties essentially establishing their claims in their possession and control of certain features in the South China Sea. They were almost exclusively military in nature, the actions and activities that were being undertaken by the parties. There were some civilian activities, but these did not carry, of course, the official authority. And there were three serious violent incidents, particularly between China and Vietnam in the Paracels and in the Spratly Islands. Okay. So that was the situation up until 1992. What happened in 1992? You had the first ASEAN Declaration of Conduct. Here, what we had is that you had ASEAN, still relatively, with most of its original members, primarily, three of the members out of the six are claimants. Okay? They agreed to commit to peaceful resolution of disputes, establish restraint, and explore maritime cooperation between them. And this was a response essentially to the 1988 incident, the violent clash between China and Vietnam. So that was the after effect. And here, what happened is that with respect to the Southeast Asian claimants, it did establish those agreed norms of behavior between them. China was not yet party to this, although it did announce later on that it would accede to the Declaration of Conduct. However, in 1994, it activated its claim to Scarborough Shoal, essentially. Up until that time, it was a paper claim, but in 94, it allowed or licensed a radio operator to set up on Scarborough Shoal, which was responded to by the Philippines. And that was the germination, that was the origin now of the Philippine-China dispute over Scarborough Shoal specifically. And then further down south, China occupied Mischief Reef, establishing huts, small huts in 95, which later on in 1999 turned out or were upgraded into full-blown condominium-type structures. So these are the acts that basically were unilateral and sort of destabilized the situation that was in place upon the signing of the 1992 ASEAN Declaration of Conduct. Now, 2000, that led, the incidents on Mischief Reef led to another flurry of diplomatic activity, which led now to the 2002 Declaration of Conduct. Okay. The 2002 Declaration of Conduct built on the 1992 Declaration, but this time you had more members. You had 10 members of ASEAN, and the claimants are now a minority. They're 4 out of the 10, plus China, signatory. They all committed to the peaceful resolution of disputes and emphasized the need to build trust and confidence on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Okay, so underscoring these 3 elements. And they affirmed freedom of navigation and overflight, self-restraint, exploration, maritime cooperation, and the commitment. And then that's where they committed to develop a full-blown code of conduct, which implied that the code of conduct would be a different type of document. It would be a unbinding document because the DOC is non-binding. However, when you look at the situation after, what happened was that there was a relative quiet for about 5 years, but the disputes again ignited in 2007 onwards on the Vietnamese side with all of those incidents taking place. And on the Philippine side of the South China Sea, you had them begin in 2011, which culminated in China taking control of Scarborough Shoal in 2012. Okay. What is observable in these short years is that there's a clear difference because between Southeast Asian claimants, they all had overlapping claims. The Southeast Asian claimants clearly were abiding by the principles in the Declaration of Conduct because even though there were certain incidents that took place between Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, those were immediately settled. The situations did not produce any escalation, did not result in any unilateral change in the status quo. But with respect to China, taking of control of Scarborough Shoal, occupation Mischief Reef, obviously were changes. Now, then that led up to 2013, okay? Because in 2012, you had this Scarborough Shoal situation. But the following year, because of increased tensions, the parties agreed to resume now code of conduct negotiations, which before that had been relatively moribund. Okay, that also coincided with the time that the Philippines decided to file arbitration proceedings against China, and that took place from 2013 to 2016. During this time, while this code of conduct is supposedly being negotiated, while it is supposed to establish those various rules, no, you had more unilateral actions being taking place. You had the creation of the China Coast Guard and the expansion of its operations into the rest of the South China Sea, as you see in the markings there. And there also the expansion of marine scientific research surveys. You had massive environmental damage and overexploitation taking place, particularly the clam digging operations, which devastated many coral reefs. On top of which, there were construction and arming of artificial islands built in the Spratly Island group. You had the expansion of PLA Navy and PLA Air Force operations based on those island bases. And so now the reach of those operations extended far into the South China Sea. And you had active interference and unilateral actions of China, such as petroleum surveys, interference with resupply, dangerous maneuvers against other vessels, taking place not near the disputed islands and rocks where they used to be, but now well within the EEZs and much closer now to the coast of the surrounding Southeast Asian nations. Last year, as close as 56 nautical miles from Luzon, no? And several times as close as 60, 80 nautical miles from Malaysia, for example. So what the interesting thing about it is that while this negotiation is going on, it appears that the actions of the parties are running directly against it. Yeah. So that, oops, sorry. Yeah. So that brings us now to some interesting observations about how the parties are relating to each other with respect to the code of conduct negotiations. When you look at the criteria that I earlier mentioned and compare them with the interactions between, say, China vis-a-vis Southeast Asian claimants and Southeast Asian claimants between other Southeast Asian claimants, it's a stark difference. Okay, with respect to the status quo, China has shown no restraint in changing the status quo, as evidenced by the artificial islands, dangerous maneuvers, interference with resupply missions, and such, and petroleum surveys in outside of their own areas. Whereas the Southeast Asian nations do not engage in such kinds of activities. With respect to self-restraint, unilateral acts such as seismic surveys, dangerous maneuvers, and disproportionate responses like those island buildings clearly evidence the absence thereof. And on the other hand, with respect to Southeast Asian claimants, they have undertaken certain activities such as island renovations, which result in a little bit with a bit of reclamation, but they're nowhere near the scale of the Chinese equivalent reclamations. No? In essence, as well, with respect to the installation of weapon systems, perhaps, no, there's simply no comparison between them. When it comes to good faith, trust and confidence, clearly, when it comes to China and Southeast Asian nations, I'm sorry, but maybe this is different from other claimants, but on the Philippine side, there's actually none at this point. But between Southeast Asian nations, there is relatively higher trust and confidence, even though they're still guarded because they know that they're still claimants, after all, competing claimants. These have, however, still allowed them to engage in concrete maritime cooperation initiatives, such as between Philippines and Vietnam, and Malaysia and Philippines, and Vietnam and Malaysia, for example. Non-prejudicial agreements, none of the parties have indicated that they give much value to this because none of them have proposed non-prejudice clauses in agreement so far. There is a proposal in the Code of Conduct negotiations ongoing, but it's one of the most controversial provisions. And then with respect to unilateral actions, we've already explained that and you've seen that. The problem here is that with respect to equality and mutuality, we have a real problem, I think, no, because, for example, with respect, it is hard to negotiate with respect when one party constantly accuses another of being a U.S. puppet, for example, leading to our own president loudly, very strongly making a statement rejecting any such narratives that we Southeast Asian nations have no agency or interests of our own in this area. And with respect to equality and mutuality, then clearly the idea that one state will have some preemptive rights over others, or should have interests that override the surrounding the smaller Southeast Asian nations' interests, others. Clearly, that kind of situation is against this idea of equality and mutuality. Okay. So, to conclude, okay, let me just make some observations. Number one, Norm making, such as which is what the South China Sea Code of Conduct negotiations process is all about. No? Norm making by co-equal states need to be founded on mutuality and self-restraint, and this means limitations on the exercise of coercive power in order to unilaterally change the status quo. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that while the process is ongoing. Trust and confidence are, after all, key, and these need to be earned by actions, not words. So, earlier descriptions about the use of certain language of win-win, language of harmony, etc., that is completely neutralized by actions on the ground. And so, one interesting point that can be seen is that there is clearly a divergence in the management interactions between Southeast Asian claimants among themselves and between Southeast Asian claimants and China when it comes to trying to establish norms of behavior. Are these portents for the future? Will this indicate a divergence in the pathways of these countries? Will we have a situation where only the Southeast Asian nations actually will abide by any future code of conduct, while the other party will simply deem itself exempt from compliance when it is convenient or when its interests are more important for it than for the others. So those are just foods for thought. Food for thought. Thank you, and I'm running out of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay, for that very innovative framework for thinking about the Code of Conduct talks. Perhaps in the Q&A session, we can get into the nitty-gritty of the second draft, which was endorsed in July of this year, and the guidelines for expediting the talks. So I'd now like to move swiftly to our second speaker. Kristy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the organizer, ISEAS, for having me here. Particularly, I know that Taiwan is usually not on ASEAN agenda, so I appreciate the opportunity to share with you a Taiwanese perspective. Yes. Yeah, so on the topic of outbreaks of hostilities in the Taiwan Strait on the region, I'll first speak a little bit about the general background, most recent development with a focus on economic aspect, and then I'll go to the impact on the region. Sorry. Yeah. China's military threats across the Taiwan Strait or in Taiwan is not something new, but recently they have become increasingly frequent and more specific. Just to share with you a few numbers as released by the National Defense Report by our Ministry of Defense last month, following U.S. House Speaker, the former U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit in Taiwan in August last year, China's PLA sent military aircraft across the median line of Taiwan Strait 302 times. And on 17th last month, the number of crossings reaching 103 tons just in one single day, which is a record and increasing test of Taiwan's response. And apart from that, there are also different threats and coercions in gray zone tactics against Taiwan. Examples are cyber attacks and also disinformation campaign, especially in the running up to the election, Taiwan's election next January, and also political and economic coercion. This includes sanctioning Taiwan's imports, particularly agricultural and fishery products, and also sanctioning individual firms, even including those firms that are supporting unification with Taiwan. And in recent months, China threats to terminate the ECFA. ECFA stands for Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. It was signed and also implemented in President Ma Ying-jeou's administration. And there are a number of reasons that China may take military action against Taiwan. And this includes its long-term plan to pursue Taiwan unification with mainland China. And also, it feels that it needs to respond to provocation from Taiwan to formally declare independence. And also China is definitely not happy to see deepening US-Taiwan defense cooperation, among others. And among all these reasons, the most important one will be about the independence. If Taiwan declares independence officially, it will immediately give Xi Jinping an official excuse for any military action. And however, I want to share with you is that though it may appear to some people that people in Taiwan now seem to support independence. However, the most recent survey in Taiwan demonstrate the opposite way, and more people now in Taiwan support maintenance status quo indefinitely, means permanently. And there are also some argument about Taiwan's silicon shields, which has become a very popular topic, meaning Taiwan's capacity to produce advanced chip by TSMC, the world's largest chip maker, and that China, if they want to invade Taiwan, they want to have the TSMC and make TSMC from a Taiwanese company to a Chinese company, and the industry know that this is not the case. Okay, and what will be the cost of Beijing invasion of Taiwan? According to a CSIS report, China will have to pay enormous price in terms of financial, economic, diplomatic, and reputational costs. Even if Beijing won the military domain, its economic and diplomatic position will definitely substantially worse off, as it will face economic sanction by the US and its allies, and also huge impact on its domestic financial market and exchange rate, and also huge impact on its external trade as well as foreign direct investment. So just to give you a snapshot of how Taiwan people stance on independence versus unification with the mainland have changed over the years. In the past 3 decades, most people in Taiwan supported maintaining status quo. However, since 2018, those supporting the percentage of those supporting maintaining status quo decide at later stage decline, and those supporting maintaining status quo indefinitely, mean permanently rose up. So last year, the percentage rose to more than 30%. And in the meantime, you will see that this this green line stands for people supporting gradual independence. The percentage reached its peak in 2020, but declined sharply. So last year, the percentage declined to only around 21.4%. So this demonstrates that people in Taiwan understand that if they support independence, that means war. And this is about the semiconductor. This slide shows you the semiconductor fabrication by geography as of 2019. So you can see from here that the light blue area stands for China's dominance already in memory chips and also for mature chips fabrication. However, the green bar stands for advanced chip, meaning chips below 10 nanometer. China wants and lacks capacity in this regard. And Taiwan actually provides more than 92% of the advanced chips to the market. And therefore, if China owns TSMC, and then probably it can help China to develop the advanced chips. However, that is not the case because the TSMC will need to have IC design and also manufacturing equipment as well as raw material from Japan, US, and also European country. So if TSMC becomes a Chinese company and then TSMC will lose access to all these materials, that means TSMC is not going to function and will not be able to develop new technology. So this will not be a reason for China to launch any military action against Taiwan. And for the second part, I'll move to the economic impact of cross-strait tensions on Southeast Asia. And because of the very close relation between Southeast Asia with China and also with Taiwan respectively, so any consequences will have huge impacts on Southeast Asia. That means Southeast Asia will not be insulated from any damaging consequences. And first of all, as of August this year, there are more than 1 million ASEAN citizens living in Taiwan. This includes 750,000 foreign workers from 4 ASEAN countries, 260,000 from Indonesia and also from Vietnam respectively, and also 150,000 from the Philippines and 68,000 from Thailand. There are also around 11,000 professionals and also 17,000 students from ASEAN countries. Not to mention that we have around 120 to 130,000 Vietnamese spouses living in Taiwan. And on trade and supply chain, a military conflict in Taiwan will definitely affect air and shipping routes in South China Sea and disrupt supply chain operations in Asia and also the globe. And this is particularly the case because under the New Southbound policy initiated by President Tsai Ing-wen in the past few years, we see significantly increasing trade between Taiwan and ASEAN, and also ASEAN as well as India now became the major destination when Taiwanese companies adjust their investment strategy to try to relocate from China or to try to restructuring their supply chain. So this shows you the share of Taiwan outbound investment by destination. And Taiwan outbound investment is actually moving from going west, meaning investing in China, to going south, meaning investing in Southeast Asia and India, and also going east, meaning investing directly in the destination market, which is the United States. And in the past 5 years, the share going to China declined to less around 1/3, while the other 2/3 go to Southeast Asia as well as European countries and also United States, meaning Taiwanese companies are getting more and more diversified. And Taiwan has also established stronger supply chain relationship with Southeast Asian countries, in particular the electronic sector, ICT, and also chip. One example is Taiwan has worked successfully with some Southeast Asian countries to expand Apple supply chain to Vietnam, Thailand, and some other countries in India. And there is also stronger chip trade between Taiwan and also ASEAN countries. So you see from this chart here that we export last year around 100 billion chips to China. And then the second largest market is Southeast Asia, where we export around 40 billion US dollars. And among ASEAN countries, the number one market is Singapore, and then followed by Malaysia, and then Vietnam is catching up quickly. And there have been a number of investment projects of replication in Southeast Asian countries, including the UMC, the world's second largest chip maker, and also the world's 8th largest chip maker, VIS. They all make investment in Singapore. And also ASE in Chinese is 日月光, which is the world's largest company for assembly, packaging, and testing. They also expand their factory in Malaysia. So, okay, so I come to the conclusion. We understand that Southeast Asia has such a close relation with both Taiwan and China. So anything happen across Taiwan's trade, Southeast Asia is going to have consequences. And the EIU evaluated huge impact in Asia Pacific due to devastation of supply chain, which created severe vulnerability in the region. Some Southeast Asian countries may feel more severe impacts because of their close relation with China, as well as dependence on chips from Taiwan. And also some countries policy go to establish domestic supply chain in certain sector will definitely be significantly delayed because of this hostility. So to conclude, diversification of supply chain in Southeast Asia will provide only limited insulation in the event of war. And so all strategists and policymakers have to work with Taiwan, with the United States, as well as China to avoid a war and also to mitigate risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kristy. That's a very comprehensive overview of Southeast Asia's interests in Taiwan. Perhaps it's worth stressing as well that those figures you provided on the number of Southeast Asians in Taiwan, they're documented workers, right? So you could add maybe 20, 30% more to that figure of those who are not documented. Okay, Yongwook, would you take the floor, please?
Sure. Okay. I'd like to thank ISEAS Yusof for inviting me to speak on this very important panel. I was asked to say a few words about the importance and implications of stability on the Korean Peninsula. One part of the reason that used to receive a lot of attention, probably less so now because of what's going on right in the Taiwan Strait. I want to state the obvious. The Korean Peninsula is extremely important for regional peace and stability. The 38th parallel is the most fortified place in the world. Korean Peninsula remains as one of the most militarized, if not the most militarized countries in the world. North Korea is a major nuclear power, de facto nuclear state, with an estimation of somewhere between 20 to 50 nuclear warheads. It also has significant biochemical weapons. So if military conflict takes place on the Korean Peninsula, it's not going to be very pretty. And then the regime in North Korea is, I think that here it's a bit challenging to describe how to describe the North Korean regime. In my opinion, it is actually a totalitarian monarchy. And therefore, in terms of its regime type, it's abnormal and unsustainable. Although its external behavior has so far been fairly rational, seeking to exploit differences between US and its allies to its own advantage, sometimes exploiting differences between its communist brothers of China and Russia to its advantage. And also I want to add that the Korean Peninsula is the only place and theater in the region where if military conflict takes place, China does not have to get involved directly. So whether it's the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait or somewhere else in this part of the world, the Chinese forces will have to get directly involved. Whereas in the Korean Peninsula, this is the only theater where military conflict can take place independently of China. So, if I were American president worrying about the future of the region, I think the worst nightmarish scenario for the USA would be military conflict taking place on the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, the USA is trying to manage all these other regional conflicts and trying to deter Chinese potential Chinese military aggression in the Taiwan Strait. So this is why we have to pay close attention to the Korean Peninsula. Now, as many of you will know, the fate of the Korean Peninsula has always been intricately linked with what happens in its external environment. And obviously, the emergence and development of the recent US-China strategic competition has significantly shaped the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. You must have seen what had happened during the Trump administration. So the initial hatred and flamboyant verbal accusations against each other, which turned into fairly consistent period of bromance. These two gentlemen exchanged love letters, right, handwritten as well, and then they went abroad together to spend some time here in Singapore, right, in Hanoi. Now, of course, that was a fairly interesting period of diplomatic engagement between US and DPRK. DPRK has always wanted to directly engage with Americans to achieve some sort of settlement on the Korean Peninsula. And Trump, unlike any other US president, was willing to take on risks and meet with the North Korean counterpart to milk out some agreement. We all know that ultimately those efforts were unsuccessful. So the summit in Singapore, for example, produced this very short agreement, 4-point agreement. And the way North Koreans accepted this agreement was the point number 2 that appears in the agreement, which is both countries will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, which DPRK interpreted as it's a requirement for the USA to remove its sanctions on Pyongyang. And then number 3, which is about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, would come right in a subsequent stage. That's the way North Korea interpreted the Singapore summit outcome. Whereas the Americans thought that all these things had to be done concurrently, right? So the moment that they signed this agreement, there was already disagreement among the parties. Therefore, nothing really progressed. And then when they met in Hanoi, the Americans were pushing North Korea to give up more than the Yongbyon nuclear facility, whereas the DPRK wanted to sell the same horse for multiple times. And that's when Americans said, we've had enough. If you don't want to give up anything other than the Yongbyon facility, there would be no agreement. And of course, Kim Jong-un could not take steps towards denuclearization, even though he was genuinely interested in striking a deal with the Americans. So that was the Trump period. And then when Biden came in, the initial Biden administration emphasized heavily on values, democratic values. So, the Conference of Democracy and so on and so forth. Therefore, there was not much progress made between US and DPRK. So this period of standstill in negotiation and dialogue between the US and North Korea. And then when the Korean government under President Yoon Suk-yeol took over, he took a decisive tilt towards the USA and based his approach to North Korea on anti-communist hardline stance. So their inter-Korean dialogue also did not have any positive development under the current Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol. Having said that, I do think that this young North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is deeply interested in socio-economic development for his country. So his father, who toyed with the idea of opening up the country for external aid, investment, and setting up some sort of tax-free zone in North Korea, in the end, he gave up that idea because he thought that doing so would be too destabilizing for the North Korean regime. But the current young leader is genuinely interested in socio-economic development. The problem for him is that he wants to keep his nuclear weapons while engaging with the international community for economic development and international aid. And of course, the international community approach to North Korea has been to drive a wedge between nukes and economic development. You cannot have both. You have to choose either one of these two. And this is where the young North Korean leader is struggling to make a hard choice. And even though he is the dictator, the domestic the nuclear industry in North Korea, with somewhere between 200,000 up to 400,000 people, depending on this particular industry, if he ventures towards denuclearization, that means that some jobs will be lost, right? In other words, there will be some domestic political consequences for the young leader. And of course, I don't think he wants to give up nuclear weapons either, for himself. So, so where to go from here? I think the disagreement between DPRK and its external parties, namely the US and South Korea, runs very deep. So no one can hope for any immediate positive outcome to come out of any negotiation. However, I think it is very important for all the parties to engage in dialogue and negotiations. Currently, there has been no dialogue, no negotiation right? Ever since Biden administration came into power, and this actually creates more dangerous situation where the U.S. and South Korea and Japan could push North Korea to go further into the communist camp. So the recent DPRK and Russia summit, right, is an example of this. When North Korea is desperate for economic aid, international aid, it's looking for any opportunity that it can explore. And Russia, with its own need, right? So here we have two communist countries coming together out of their own deep-seated needs for the other. What can Southeast Asia and ASEAN do for the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula? I think here, obviously in terms of material benefits and military support, ASEAN probably cannot play a significant role. But in terms of providing diplomatic engagement with DPRK, I think ASEAN can do a lot more than what it has done. So, engage with DPRK with the purpose of changing the deep-seated misperceptions of DPRK towards the external environment. No one is willing to invade North Korea. No one is willing to overthrow the regime. The only way for North Korea to survive in the current international system is to engage with the external parties, right? International community, open up, right? Engage in reform so that its people can, right, benefit from reform and socio-economic development. So, Ian, let me stop here, and I look forward to taking your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Yongwook. That was quite a sobering assessment of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And so we have roughly 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you could think of your questions and raise your hand, and please identify yourself and try to keep your questions short. But before we do that, I will exercise my prerogative as moderator and ask some questions. My first question is to Jay. Jay, if you were a bookie, what odds would you put on the code of conduct being signed by, well, we heard this morning, 3 years, 2025, 2026. What odds would you put on that? I'm not a betting man, by the way.
Yeah, I'm not a betting man. Let's see. By 2025, 2 years, I think. For something to be, well, for them to be able to complete the negotiations, given the pace, despite and including the acceleration, I think maybe 1 in 3 chances of it being signed, okay, which is relatively high. But question there is not really the act of signing; it's the content. And I think that a 1 in 3 chance of them signing a content would mean that 1 in 3 chances of signing a document would mean that the content would not be as groundbreaking as people were expecting.
Can I push you a little further on that then? What are the main obstacles to signing a code of conduct between now and within the next 3 years?
The main obstacle right now is the so-called milestones. I think that up to now there hasn't really been any clear sign that they're going to come to an agreement on the milestones, geographic area, nature of the document, involvement of external parties, and whether it's legally binding or not. So those are key questions. Actually, I think milestones is the wrong term. These are actually threshold questions. They have to answer them before they can proceed to anything substantive. And so far, despite the years of negotiations, they haven't been able to do so. There has been some, I know that there has been some progress in terms of eliminating really non-starter parts, no? But they are really pushing to at least go through the second read. Wait, maybe I should revise my estimate. It's not really signing the document, it's completing the second reading. Sorry. Yeah, because I'm thinking of them going through each and every one of those, something more than 50 articles. So that's what the acceleration, the guidelines for acceleration is doing, is allowing them a process to go through the paragraphs, give them all a once over. But then if they don't answer the threshold questions, if they don't agree on the milestones, everything will fall apart.
And Kristy, can I push you a little bit further, because one of the the key question of this panel is what role can ASEAN play in helping to manage tensions in the Taiwan Straits? What role do you think is there for ASEAN? I know it must be quite limited because of that. Sino, cross-straits tensions, cross-straits relations have a dynamic all of their own. But what would you advise the ASEAN states to do?
I would expect ASEAN to play a more active role, because right now the U.S. is having a very frequent dialogues with ASEAN, and also ASEAN can talk with China. So ASEAN can play a certain role in between the U.S. and China, and also Singapore, I think, can particularly play a more active role, because Singapore was the place when Ma Ying-jeou, and also Ma Ying-jeou met with his counterpart leader many years ago, and also Singapore used to communicate between two sides. So I think Singapore, if you think, probably can also play a more active role.
Thank you. Okay, so do we have any questions from the floor? I see my colleague Ha. And is Joe, are you brushing your hair or raising your hand? You're raising your hand. So perhaps Ha and then Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. My question goes to Prof. Batongbacal. Both ASEAN and China are claiming progress in the COC negotiations, and they have tried to create some artificial milestones of progress, like first reading, second reading, or most recently, the guidelines to accelerate the COC negotiations. And yet the reality at sea paints a starkly different picture, as you have just articulated in your presentation. China is pressing ahead with its coercive activities and excessive claims, but at the same time, it is using the COC process to tell the South China Sea story well. Do you think that it is time for ASEAN to change tact by calling a spade, debunk the COC myth by exposing true stories at sea? And do you think that this approach, this new approach, may possibly have a better effect in moderating the Chinese behavior, or would it incentivize China to engage in more confrontational activities? Thank you.
Yes, actually, personally, I think it is time to change track. The COC process is an ASEAN sort of thing. Meaning that it's taken a life of its own as a process, not necessarily, but and it seems to be the only way by which ASEAN can claim that it is doing something about the South China Sea disputes. That being said, though, the process has not really produced results for decades now, and as you've seen in the history that I presented, the bigger problem is that it works with the smaller Southeast Asian countries who regard themselves as equal to each other, but it doesn't seem to work with China because it claims some kind of preemptive status and preemptive rights, and that is being underscored by unilateral activities that are, yes, coercive in nature. I have advocated the unilateral track, okay, which is not necessarily precluded by the Code of Conduct negotiations, as far as I'm concerned, because ASEAN does have a record of pursuing unilateral cooperation, or less than ASEAN, in issues which concern only those that are participating in that smaller effort. And it has produced results. So you have the trilateral cooperation arrangement, you have the SOMS cooperation. These are examples of smaller scale, shall we say, or ASEAN minus activities, which still achieve the results of promoting cooperation and actually managing whatever problems they have between themselves. At this point, given what's happening, I think that option should be open. Whether this will change China's behavior or not, it's up to China. But so far, the record and the posture seems to be that regardless of what happens on the negotiating table, they will continue to pursue unilateral coercive activities, unfortunately. So that's something that the Southeast Asian nations will have to probably face up to pretty soon as things get worse for certain countries.
Thank you, Jay. Joe, could we have the microphone over here? Anybody else? Raise your hand.
Thank you, Yan and the panelists. I'm Joanne from the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I also have a similar question from my colleague Ha, and I don't think you have really answered it. It's about the guidelines on the ASEAN's guidelines on the acceleration of the COC negotiations. I mean, will it really make a difference? And also on the COC, we know that China has recently came out with a 10 dash line. So that's actually one extra line. Will it complicate the process in the COC negotiations, especially in the geographical scope, now that you have an even bigger area to contend with China? And of course, on the minilateral track that you mentioned, I think it's an interesting idea because I had a paper that actually talked about that. Do you mean a minilateral track within ASEAN, like the 4 claimant states within ASEAN to come up with a common position first before ASEAN actually conducts the negotiation with China? So that's for Dr. Batongbacal. And for Dr. Yongwook, you mentioned about the importance of diplomatic engagement, of course, with the DPRK. But what about the ASEAN Regional Forum? I mean, now that DPRK is also part of this ASEAN-led mechanism, can the ARF actually do a little bit more to engage with North Korea in that sense? Thank you.
Sure. Should I go first? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I think any kind of engagement with DPRK, will be useful. So whether it's within ARF or any other settings, that will go some way to to increase stability on the Korean Peninsula. But having said that, North Korea really wants to sit down with the Americans, right? So they always treated Americans as the only negotiating partner. So unless there's a breakthrough between U.S. and North Korea, right, we won't see real progress on the Korean Peninsula. But any kind of engagement coming from ASEAN would go a long way. And then, if I may say a few words about the South China Sea disputes, just raising a couple of issues that I think people oftentimes neglect. First one is, even if you sign this binding COC, enforcement is always an issue. And as we've already seen, from 2016, arbitral ruling, who's going to enforce this? And there is only one actor who can really have some impact on enforcement, and that's the United States. And therefore, if I were disputing party of Southeast Asia to the South China Sea dispute, I would think about developing separate relationship with the USA, just for the purpose of enforcing some of these provisions. And another issue is that I think ASEAN member states need to think carefully that concluding a binding COC may not serve their interest. Right? Already ASEAN faces multiple situations, multiple issues where their division comes to the fore. And if COC gets signed, and of course the actual terms matter more than timing, and I absolutely agree with our panelists. That's why I cannot say too much because we have to see the final contents and terms of COC. But I think COC could become a source of friction within ASEAN and further weaken ASEAN's internal unity. So that's something that I think ASEAN member states who are engaged in COC should consider, right, more in the future.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, on the question, the guidelines for acceleration, will it make a difference? It can make a difference in the sense that it provides more opportunities for the parties to meet and conduct their negotiations, because previous to that, they only had 2 opportunities each year. So that contributed naturally to the slowness of the pace. So the guidelines for acceleration was enabled them to have intersessional sessions, etc., which sort of facilitated the discussions and, yes, sort of accelerated it, from glacial to metaglacial, I guess. And then with respect to the 10-dash line, will it complicate the process? I think between China and ASEAN, the 10-dash line map doesn't really matter in the sense that their concerns are in the enclosed area. The 10th line in the map is more an issue related to Taiwan. And the other question that it raises is that will there be an 11th line after that goes further up towards the Yellow Sea. So that's probably something. It would involve other disputes over other areas now. No? But for ASEAN, what matters, I think, and the Southeast Asian claimants, what matters is that it's in the enclosed area denominated the South China Sea. And that's still within the 9-dash line. And in any case, the ruling of the South China Sea arbitration has already established that no matter how many lines you draw, China does not have a valid claim to that entire area unless it's, it does not have a valid claim to any areas beyond what is provided for by UNCLOS. On the unilateral track, yes, I agree. Actually, I've also been personally advocating that really should be done for claimant states can take the initiative, because really, in the end, they're the ones who will be directly affected by any code of conduct. The other states have been rather indifferent, even in the course of the negotiations. And we even have a problem where one state is not even a party to UNCLOS, even though the code of conduct speaks of affirming UNCLOS. So you have those complications. So I think it really would help if the 4 claimant countries actually did come to an agreement between themselves first before going to the negotiations. 4 claimant countries and 1 country that still denies that it's claimant. And then, yeah, Indonesia, yeah, because Indonesia, even though it denies it's a claimant, is definitely still affected by it. On the comment of our co-panelists with respect to the relationship with the US, I think here the issue is that different countries, different members have rather different attitudes towards the US, but none of them, I think, are considering involving third parties for purposes of enforcement. No? I think that's a bit too complicated for them. But definitely a large number, more of them know that third parties are relevant and should somehow be addressed in the code of conduct. And then I agree also that the binding code of conduct may not serve their interest. And this actually was raised as soon as the idea because for so many decades the negotiation was supposedly for non-binding instrument, and then suddenly there was a quick turnaround that they were advocating a binding instrument. So that raised suspicions again because of the context, lack of trust and confidence. So for now, most of the countries, I believe, have adopted a wait-and-see attitude. They want to see the actual text first that is finally agreed before they can agree on the nature of the document as binding or non-binding.
Just to clarify on that, there's been a lot of misreporting on this. The 10th dash was already on the map. I have at least 2 copies in my office of the new standard map, which that 10th dash is on the east coast of Taiwan. It was added in the early 2000s, and arguably it was there all the time. It's just it was cropped out from the map. it was funny that the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs protested the 10th dash in August, and they'd done it 10 years earlier as well and forgotten that that dash was already there. So, okay, Termsak.
Thank you, Dr. Ian. Termsak from the Thailand Study Program in ISEAS. I used to serve in the ASEAN Secretariat and took part in the negotiation with the Chinese. One of our problems, as I saw it, is that the Chinese are very good at dividing the four claimant states in ASEAN, making them each feel that they have special relation with Beijing, including Philippines, especially during Duterte time. My question is about Itu Aba typing. One of the decision points in the ruling in the 2016 International Arbitration Court is that none of the contested features in disputed area in South China Sea qualify as an island under UNCLOS. So my question to Jay and Dr. Kristy, what are the thinking, reaction to this ruling point in Manila, in Taipei?
Yeah, I think yes, the status of Ito Aba was I think an unavoidable question when once the Philippines decided to pursue the litigation track and it settled on a particular idea of how the South China Sea should be divided and how UNCLOS should apply to the South China Sea, how it would allocate the waters basically. Um, Ito Aba was one of those, as the largest island, was really the key there to the theory that was being pushed by the Philippines before the tribunal. So when it succeeded, then well, of course the Philippines regarded that as a victory. It did produce friction with Taiwan, unfortunately, but again, it was unavoidable. If the Philippines was to pursue its case, it really had to address it. Internally, it did cause also controversy within the government circles, and there were, well, not blows traded, but let's say reputations attacked and fell because of that internal debate. But in the end, the decision had to be made, and it was made.
About 5 more. Oh, I was. Okay. My recollection in July 2016 was that Taipei's response to the arbitral tribunal was as apoplectic as China's. They rejected it largely because of Ituaba. And well, they argue that it is capable of sustaining human habitation, that there's fresh water there, that you can grow plants and vegetables and that kind of thing. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Do we have any questions from the floor, particularly on Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula? Or have our presenters resolved those 2 issues? Sorry, where? Okay, gentleman over here.
Hi, Raman here again from Lowy Institute. This is the 3rd time I'm asking questions. Okay, I think this question is for Professor Kristy. I noted the 1 million number just now. Yeah, I understand from a source in the intelligence source from one of the ASEAN country that they have began evacuation planning from Taiwan. So the question is, how open or sensitive Taiwan is to work together with interested ASEAN member state on an evacuation plan? And on second question is with Professor J. I don't think the South China Sea negotiation can be completed by 2025 because there could be a new development. One of the development I noted earlier this year is that the Chinese Navy has begun interfering in a civilian flight across the South China Sea. And there's a report that they have also interfered in civilian flight on the northern part of the Malacca Strait. So do you think this development may affect the negotiation in the South China Sea? Thank you.
I think that issue has been raised in the past few months. I remember that our Ministry of MOFA already responded that they will work whenever it is necessary to with Indonesian government and also some others to for that kind of plans.
Yeah. Well, actually, I agree with you. I mean, negotiations cannot be completed, meaning that a full signed on by all parties. I mean, where everybody will be happy. I don't think will be possible by 2025. As I mentioned earlier, I retracted my one in three, and downgraded it to just finishing the reading. No? Doesn't necessarily mean that they will be happy with that and can go on to what so-called third reading. In fact, there is even I heard that there's even provision for fourth, fifth, sixth reading if necessary. Um, Interference with civilian flights, I think it can affect the negotiations in the sense that it will be taken as another sign of China's intentions for the South China Sea and Southeast Asia in general, and that will only add to the absence of trust and confidence in the negotiating process, no, and that will mean that it will again keep the parties from really committing fully to the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. We have a couple of more minutes. Do we have any further questions from the floor? Seems not. Okay, well, just a couple of minutes early, perhaps we can wrap up and have a earlier coffee break so we can stay on time. I think we've had a very useful discussion on the three flashpoints in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, and given us a lot to think about, and hopefully that these tensions will be managed better than they are currently being managed. So please join me in thanking our three speakers.